I've got all the tenons cut now and shaped and trimmed, and so they're ready to go. So the next thing I need to do is cut the dadoes for the drawer supports. They're going to go in the rear and front aprons, right? They're going to go on either side of the drawer. So in order to do that, I need to know where the parts are going to go and what orientation. What I've got here, I've got my parts laid out the way I want them. I've taken a look and decided this, I want this face out, not this face out, this face up. And my front apron, I had put a very light triangle on here to mark which was the front, and that also is going to help me locate my drawer front in here. And then the back apron has this streak on it, which I don't want to see, so I'm going to put that facing like that. So now I need to mark these. So I'm going to use the triangle marking method again. So I'll take the front and rear aprons, and I'm going to put the top and bottom of a triangle on there. I'm hoping that'll focus on there. And then on the side aprons, I'm going to put the left and right side of a triangle there. So there is that one. And this also now, with my legs, I will know which tenon goes in which leg. And so I'm going to fit check all the tenons and maybe do any trimming that needs to be done. Some of them I think are a little bit tight. Now that I've got these marked, let's go ahead and cut the dados for the drawer supports. I've switched out the dado set for a 1/2 inch setup. It turns out my drawer supports, in order to get the material from a piece that I had, which was a little over 1.25 inches thick, I resawed that. I'm going to use that for my drawer supports. So they're only going to be a 1/2 inch thick. They're only about 10 inches long, so it's not like I need a lot of strength there. So I've got the dado set up. I've got the depth, just double check here, set. So it's about an eighth of an inch. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as I'm pretty close. And what I need to do now I've got my mark here, so I know this is the back side. I'm going to bring this forward, and I want the support flush or slightly proud of this piece here. Now I have not milled the drawer support yet. I'm going to mill it to fit in the dado that I get. So it's a little bit thick, but it's going to sit like that, and I want this inner surface where the drawer is going to ride, like I said, flush or just proud of that. So I'm going to set that down on here, and I'm just feeling inside here. So I'm going to position this stop so that I can just barely feel the tooth sticking past there. So I'll clamp this in place, and I'm going to make that cut, and then with the other one at the other end, all right, this is the back, and I can tell by my mark here which direction it goes. I'll lay it down like that and make that dado. Then I'll do the same thing for the other end. Now, ideally, if I got my opening perfectly centered, the setup should work, but because of how that was done, I don't know if it's perfectly centered. We'll check it after this one's done here. Now, I had forgotten I need to put a backer board back there, otherwise I'll get tear out on the back side of the cut. So I've just got a piece of 1/4 inch MDF that I'm going to clamp on there to prevent the tear out. Using a push block to hold that down. And making the cut. Then I'll do the same thing on the rear apron. Checking the orientation. And there we go. Let's see if the other side matches up. Yeah, it's good. So I'll go ahead and cut those, and then those parts will be ready to go. The last thing I need to do is fit the tenons to each mortise. Now, of course, ideally they would all fit perfectly, but you know, perfect is not always attainable. So I've got the, this is the left apron, and I've got the left rear leg here, so this goes in here, and it's a little tight, okay? In fact, it's pretty tight. So I want it to go in with just a little bit of pressure, because when I put glue on, it's going to swell up a little bit and get even harder to put in. So right now it's too difficult to put in. So you have a couple of options. One option, which is a lousy option, is to try to make the mortise bigger. We're not going to do that. We're going to make the tenon smaller. So you could, I suppose, you could, I've seen people try and sand it, but it's difficult to hold the sanding block and keep things parallel. You could, I suppose, you could take a chisel and try and chisel it. That's not a very good option. What works best is a shoulder plane. This is a shoulder plane. They come in different sizes, different widths. And the nice thing about the plane, a shoulder plane, is the blade goes all the way to the edge of the sole. So it allows me to plane right into that corner. Now, it's actually made to do the shoulders of a tenon, which is why it's called a shoulder plane, but we're not going to use it like that. So I've got a planing stop just in my bench here, in my vise. I'm going to use, so I'm going to make sure I'm referenced on the front there, and all right, so it's not taking much of a cut. There we go. So the nice thing about the shoulder plane is if it's set up correctly, it keeps things pretty parallel. So I'm going to take a little bit off each side. And we'll try that. Beautiful. Okay, so well, maybe a touch loose. Ideally, I like it to, well, for an apron about this size, ideally it would just stay put, but that's great. And when I put it in there, I can, move it up and down a little bit to get it so it's aligned with the top. I don't see any gaps, so that's great. So I'll continue to do that with the rest of the tenons, and then we'll put everything together and dry fit it and see how it's looking. One last thing before I finish this up, and that is, as I was fitting the tenons into the legs, I realized that when I put two aprons in here, the tenons hit at the corner. I wasn't sure how much that was going to happen. I knew I had a little bit of an issue there. I need to put a little cut on here at about 45 degrees. Now, in the past, if I have to remove a fair amount of material there, I'll actually go to the chop saw and make a cut on the chop saw like that, set the blade at 45 and just trim off a little bit. But in this case, it's such a small amount, and I've already got the plane and everything set up here. I'm just going to use the shoulder plane and create a small, essentially a chamfer on the inside corner, and that should be plenty. I could also use a block plane. I don't really need a shoulder plane for this, but it's handy. So that should be enough to clean that up. I've milled my drawer supports to thickness, so they fit nicely now in the dados. So I'll cut these to length after I've got the table dry fit, then I'll know exactly how long they need to be. So my next step is to put this together and we'll see how it looks. So I've got each part labeled like I mentioned before. So that's the right front leg. I want to start with the back leg. That's goes like that. So I'm looking at my marks. There's the top of my triangle there. I think I'm going to put this together upside down. It makes it easy to get everything flush there now. Okay, so I've got some clamps here. So I'm just going to put this on here like this. And I'm going to put the clamp like that because I'm going to turn the table over here. Well, maybe I'm not. I'm just going to leave it. That's going to work just fine. Okay, so that all looks great. I don't see gaps where my tenons come together there. That looks good. That all fits nicely. I'm very happy with that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to trim these. They're still a little bit wide, so I'm going to cut them to width, and then I will cut one end, and then I'll just hold these up in the correct location and mark them and cut them to length. All right, I've got these milled. I've got them cut on one end, nice and square. So I'm going to just hold them up into the correct position and put a knife mark where I want to cut them. Now, I've got that zero clearance set up on my chop saw. So when I go to my chop saw, the fence is going to be here, and I want to be cutting here. So I need to make sure I put my mark in this corner. This is the rough end. If I put it over here, it doesn't help me. So I just want to make sure when I set this on here. Now that's going to be hard to reach in there, so I'll do it this way. So marking knife. Allow me to be very accurate here. Okay, now just, it's quite possible that these aren't exactly the same length, so I'm going to mark which is which here. So L on here, and R, and we'll go cut these to length. So that should fit right there. Looks good. That one's a touch snug, but that's all right. Nice. Okay, so that looks good. Next up, I'll cut the corner blocks. I've not made those yet. And then I'm going to detail everything. So we'll do some sanding, and then we can glue this up. I'm making the glue blocks, which are 3/4 of an inch square with a 45-degree corner on them. And you might be tempted to cut a piece 3/4 inch square and then cut it at 45 degrees. But the problem with that is if I'm on the table saw and I'm say cutting towards the camera here, so table, fence, blade tilted this way, as I'm making that cut, I only have about 1/8 of an inch of material that's supporting that piece after the cut. So it's a little dangerous if that, obviously we don't want that to rock down into the blade. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with a little wider piece. This is about 1.5 inches wide. It's plenty long. I'll get all of my glue blocks out of this. I need 4 of them. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this piece at 45 degrees. So I will remove that material. See if that shows up there. And then once I've cut that, then I'll cut this off, and that will be my off cut. And I'll have whatever left over. This could be 6 inches wide, it could be a couple inches wide. So it's a much safer way to do that. I won't be able to joint that edge that I saw of the off cut, which is my part, but it's a glue block. It's just going to get glued on there anyway. It's not a visible surface. So that'll make that much easier and safer. Okay, so I've got my parts here. Now you may notice these are not, this is not the same long piece I had before. What happened was I messed up. When I cut the first one of these, I made the angled cut, and then I sent the fence to 3/4 and made my second cut. Well, I forgot that it's the offcut that I cared about, not the distance, not the piece between the fence and the blade, and so my part was too small, so I had to do it again. So what you saw was take 2. So I will cut these to length. Now these are going to be kind of short. They're going to sit in here, and I don't want them flush with aprons, so I'm going to cut them about 1/4 inch shorter than my apron width. So the apron on mine is 3 1/4. I'll cut these to 3, and then I'll center them, so there'll be an 1/8 inch gap at either end. I've got the table apart now, and I'm going to sand everything. It's certainly much easier to sand the parts before the project goes together. So I typically want to get the sanding done as quickly as possible. So whatever it takes to get that done most efficiently is the technique I'm going to use. So for a part like this, I'm probably not going to use a random orbital sander. It's kind of on the edge of whether I think that's faster or not. But I think for something like this, I'm quicker sanding by hand than with a random orbital. For my top, I'll definitely use the random orbital sander. But because of how I do this, I find that sanding by hand is more quick than using a machine. So what I'll do is I'm going to put this in a vise, and I've got a different sanding block for each grit. That's a big part of why this goes quickly, because with a random orbit sander, I've got to let the thing stop after each grit. I've got to pull the grit off of the Velcro or sticky back. I've got to put it back on. Unless I had a sander for each grit, this is going to be quicker. So for this surface, and I should point out that I'm not going to do the top edge. The top edge has my triangle mark on it. I'm not going to round either of these corners, right, because they're up under the top. I'm only going to round these bottom edges here, bottom corners. And at least right now, I'm not going to round this inside one because, well, actually in this case I could. But you got to be careful where parts come together sometimes, that you sand a place that doesn't need to be sanded later. In this case, I will round this because when the drawer supports are in here, rounding this doesn't hurt anything. If this was sitting like this, flat on here, then I would not want to round that first. But in this case, it's going to be fine. I've got, like I said, a different grit on each sanding block. They're marked. One side is hard, and the other side has a cork backing on it. And I will typically use the hard side up to about 150 grit, and then from 180 on, I will use the cork side. I also like to have a light raking across here. That just makes it easier to see what I'm doing, because remember, every time I sand or various other processes to finish something, I want to remove the previous operations marks or flaws or whatever you want to call them. So in this case, I've got marks from my jointer or planer on here. So it's hard to see those if I've just got, you know, fluorescent light, which we typically have in the shop or what I have in my shop. So a kind of a point light source that's down low allows me to see very easily what I'm removing. So I'm starting with the hard side. I want to keep the swarf off of there. Now there's a touch of snipe at this end, and you probably can't see it on the camera, but I can see it. Okay, it's gone. Okay, and I've got a little bit more down here. I can feel it. So I'm trying to make sure I keep this flat. I'm not, you know, rounding anything. So there's 120. Okay, and I always want to remove the swarf or the dust after each grit. So this is 180, and I'm using the cork side now. You can see how easy it is to switch grits. Okay, I'm done. So I'll continue to do that for the edges. I'll put these in a vise, so it's a little easier to reach. I guess I could put them here, but this sometimes is a little tippy. The legs I already did. To round these corners, what I'll do is I'll typically, for the roundover I want to do, which is about a 1/16, I'm going to keep these edges fairly square. I'll take probably my 150 grit and put just a chamfer on there. I start with a chamfer because it's easy to see how much you've done, and then I'll go through the rest of the grits doing that. If it was a bigger roundover, say certainly more than a 1/16, closer to an 1/8, I would sand to 180, and then I'd use a roundover bit to put a radius on there, and then sand after that. But for a small radius, it's quicker just to sand that on there. So I'll continue to do that, and next step is the glue up.